Andy Worthington will begin tonight by speaking broadly about the importance of Wikileaks and what it reveals about state secrecy. Attempts to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. Few people have written about Guantanamo and advocated for justice for the men who remain and have been released as tirelessly as Andy has, written as prolifically and compellingly about the issue. I will take this moment to say, here's his book, The Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison. It's the first book documenting the stories of all the men at Guantanamo. I highly recommend it. His film, Outside the Law, Stories from Guantanamo, is extremely worth purchasing, viewing, doing screenings of. It's about Guantanamo, but more broadly, it's about the global war on terror as well. Andy will begin, again, speaking about Wikileaks and Guantanamo broadly. And from there, we will go to Pardiss Kebriaei, who, as I mentioned, is an attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. She has been representing men at Guantanamo since 2007, and also represents the families of the men who died there in 2006 under extremely questionable circumstances. I think she will talk about this case, and it's particularly timely as just over the past year, 4 soldiers who were at the base when these men died, courageously leaked in a story to Harper's that what they saw at the base did not match the official story of that these deaths were simply suicides, and that what happened was covered up. So she'll be speaking about an extremely important story, which is and how a set of leaks relate to the story, and these leaks are not WikiLeaks, but another extremely important story that hasn't had the public discussion, the public attention that it really deserves. And I don't want to take too much time here, but also right before we came here, part of the reason Pardiss and I were rushing a bit late to come to the Brecht Forum is because news just broke out that the Obama administration forcibly transferred Mr. Fathi Said bin Mohammed, an Algerian man. He was just forcibly transferred against his will, secretly, suddenly, back to Algeria, which is a place he really feared. He didn't want to go back after almost a decade in detention, and the Obama administration just forcibly transferred him. So it's very, it's tragic and timely, and she might touch upon that as well, perhaps if there's time or in Q&A. Katie Gallagher, also an attorney from CCR, will speak after Pardiss. She is dealing with cases having to do with accountability for torture. She's involved in a couple right now outside of the United States because accountability for torture in U.S. courts has been so impossible to pursue that her work is extremely significant for trying to pursue accountability for torture abroad. She is involved in 2 cases, which some of you may have heard of, though it certainly hasn't been covered enough in the U.S. press. 2 cases pursuing accountability for torture in Spain. What we have learned from WikiLeaks recently is that the Obama administration over the past year has been interfering in Spain as in a political campaign to try to stop the courts or pressure the government to stop the courts from allowing the pursuit of accountability for torture in Spain. So in Spain, this is all over the news, and the United States, it's not so much, and she will talk about this case and also developments in the case. So I think that's extremely exciting. If any of you have any contacts in Spain or Madrid, you'll know that the country has been really on fire since these leaks came out, which in my view it's not so surprising that the US should be trying to interfere in another country, but it's certainly notable, and the silence about it in this country is notable. So hopefully together we can break that silence. And Jeremy, again, Jeremy Varon, he's a professor of history at the New School. He's a friend. He's with Witness Against Torture, a really remarkable group of activists that I'll let him tell you about how they formed and what they are doing as citizens, as regular conscientious, ethical people, to bring an end to the torture at Guantanamo and beyond. And Witness Against Torture is, along with CCR, we've been working together in other groups to go to DC on January this year, marking again the horrible beginning of the 10th year of Guantanamo. And we'll tell you all about some of the work that they'll be doing there, and like me, invite all of you to join us in DC, to do events here, etc. And quickly, before I come to Andy, I'll say that there's some people in the audience, like Nancy Talanian, who's sitting in front of me. The cameras can't see. She's with No More Guantanamos. Also an example of another very important group who's been advocating for justice there. That we have people here from 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows who we're really honored to have here as very important ethical voices to help see a better day in this country and ensure that that real justice comes about. So, with no further ado, Andy.
Okay, thank you, Leili. Hello, everybody. I'm very glad you all turned up because this was something that was put together at such short notice. I hope I'm going to make sense. It's something like the middle of the night to me because I flew in from London today. My suitcase is there. I didn't even have time to stop off where I'm staying. I got a bite to eat and came down here. I'm sure anybody who was vaguely aware of the news last year can't have failed to come across the Wikileaks story, and it's been a fascinating one in terms of the role of the internet really as fulfilling what traditionally was a role held by the old media of what happens when whistleblowers leak powerful information that is in the public interest. And this is a story that's very much alive because we're hearing persistent stories and rumors about how the Obama administration wants to find a way to try and extradite Julian Assange to the US. Believes possibly that under the Espionage Act there might be some kind of case to be made. I'm not sure this is going to have legs. I hope it doesn't, because I think that one of the things that's interesting about the WikiLeaks story and about Julian Assange is how he's kind of set himself up as in a way as some kind of rogue internet personality trying to expose secrets in all kinds of ways. But what actually happened last year with the big stories that WikiLeaks revealed, starting with the video of the killings in Iraq, and then the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs, and most recently the classified US diplomatic cables, is how they forged a relationship with major media outlets, the Guardian in the UK and various other European newspapers, and with the New York Times included, that actually is overlapping the role that WikiLeaks has with the traditional media, and actually, I think, just providing a new form of what the traditional media has done when it's been given this kind of powerful information that the public needs to know. I hope very much that these attempts to somehow hold him accountable will come to nothing, because he is essentially doing what's been done for decades by the media, which is to disseminate information that's been provided. What's interesting about this story, and I think we're starting to see more of a focus now on Bradley Manning, who is allegedly the US Army private who had access to intelligence, who allegedly provided this information. I mean, we obviously don't know this. There has been no trial. It was disturbing to me a few months back when all the focus seemed to be on Julian Assange, and so much attention was being distracted away from the source of the information. And it's been disturbing to read about the fact that he's now been held for 7 months. He was first held in Kuwait, he's now held in a US military brig, that he's held under a form of solitary confinement that I found very worrying when I read about him. Now, apparently because he had been put on suicide watch, and I'm not convinced that there was a good reason for this, but he's been deprived of possessions. I mean, he lives in a bare cell with very little contact. He's not allowed to exercise. He's given very little kind of stimulation or items that he can have. And it all sounds really grimly familiar to me, to the conditions in which people have been held in Guantanamo, and the conditions in which a handful of people were held on the US mainland under the Bush administration, when the Bush administration held 3 US citizens as enemy combatants here in America. Jose Padilla was one of them, a man who had been held in Guantanamo at the beginning until the Bush administration found out that he was, although he lived in Saudi Arabia, he was an American citizen, at which point they immediately got him out of there and put him in a military brig on the US mainland. And an American resident called Ali El-Mari. And all 3 of these men spent a number of years subjected to horrendous isolation. In some ways worse than a lot of the isolation in Guantanamo, because there was nobody else around. They were held in cells in otherwise unoccupied cell blocks. And the worst of the isolation in their cases, lasted for kind of over a year in some of these cases. And it sounds familiar, and the worry of that is that that's intended to break this man, and it's intended to break him so that he may then provide some information, be coerced into providing some information that would enable the US government to go after Julian Assange more effectively. So these are stories that are very much alive and very worrying, I think. But the other aspect of the WikiLeaks story that interested me particularly was partly was the revelations of the suppression of the torture inquiries in Germany and in Spain, and I know that Katie's going to talk about those. In terms of Guantanamo, what was interesting was that what largely came out was, as with a lot of the diplomatic cables, was a really rather seedy story of what actually happens behind the scenes in diplomacy. And in the case of Guantanamo, what we were mostly hearing about was the desperation with which State Department officials were trying to get other countries to take cleared prisoners from Guantanamo who couldn't be returned to their home countries because they faced the risk of torture. Men actually like Fahay Saeed bin Mohammed, who, as we've just heard, has been forcibly sent back to Algeria today when he didn't want to go there. And there certainly, was the possibility that some other country would have taken this man. So it's going to be interesting how this story unfolds. But this is what we got out of WikiLeaks. There was this period where we were hearing about, offering a country that many people hadn't even heard of, the opportunity to have a meeting with President Obama if they'd take a prisoner, and huge amounts of money being offered. And I think the impression I got most of all out of it was a figure around $80,000 being the kind of price tag for taking one of these people that the Obama administration needed to get rid of. And what interested me about this story in particular, as I say, was not so much that this horse trading was going on. I think it was obvious that that this would be happening. What it clarified for me was the extent to which it was going on, and what worried me as a result was that I think about 16 countries around the world have taken Guantanamo prisoners who couldn't be repatriated. About 36 men have been taken in. And what these reports suggested to me was that the priorities for the welfare of these men came very, very low down, if at all. And this isn't really something that there's been any coherent investigation of at the moment. What life after Guantanamo is like for people who, have been given new homes, but on a basis that is pretty ad hoc, that has been decided on a country-by-country basis, that maybe with countries that nobody has the infrastructure in place or the experience or the knowledge of dealing with former Guantanamo prisoners. It's a whole new ground. But that worried me, and continues to worry me, and I think that it really needs looking into of the welfare of these former prisoners. But what was missed out in this story was the explanation of why it was required in the first place for the State Department and Daniel Fried, who Obama appointed as a special envoy to Guantanamo, a man who I think has probably got more air miles than anybody in the world, because of the countries he's visited, trying to persuade them to take these cleared prisoners. What wasn't mentioned in any of the stories was why these countries were needed to do this in the first place. Where was America in all of this? And it was missed out of the story, and it really shouldn't have been missed out of the story, because the reason that this had to happen was that because every door that anybody had tried to open to allow any of these people into the United States had been slammed shut, and it remains the position today. And I think it's probably worth me just finishing by just running through those elements and how that happened. In June 2008, when the prisoners at Guantanamo won for the second time habeas corpus rights from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gave them habeas corpus rights in June 2004. Congress then stepped in to take them away, and in June 2008, the Supreme Court gave them constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. In October 2008, 17 men, the Uyghurs, these are men from China's Xinjiang province in the northwest of China, men who had been living in a rundown settlement in the mountains in Afghanistan, which had been bombed at the start of the US-led invasion, had then fled to Pakistan, where they were welcomed by villagers who then sold them to Pakistani forces, who then sold them to the Americans. The Bush administration, in a very rare incident, had actually abandoned all claims that these men were enemy combatants. They won their habeas corpus petition. The judge, Ricardo Urbina, who struck me in 2008 as one of the great judges of that year, said, look, these are men that you have acknowledged you have imprisoned wrongly. They have won their habeas corpus petition. They cannot be held anymore at Guantanamo. It's unconstitutional to do so. You have failed to find another country that will take them. I demand that you bring these men to my courtroom and we will resettle them in the United States. There were plans in place from the Uyghur community in the Washington, D.C. area, and another community, not of Uyghurs, but of concerned American citizens in Tallahassee in Florida, were going to take some of these men as well. The Bush administration appealed. When Obama came in, the Justice Department continued to fight this, and the D.C. Circuit Court said that all these matters to do with that these were matters to do with immigration, and that it was not for the courts to decide, that it was up to the executive to decide. So Obama's Justice Department had prevented wrongly imprisoned men from being offered new homes in the United States. The D.C. Circuit Court had backed that up. The kind of most shocking thing, I think, really, it's politically explicable, but I'll tell you, was that in the early months of when President Obama was in power, the White House counsel, Greg Craig, the man who had really pushed for those executive orders that were issued on the second day when Obama was in office, promising to close Guantanamo, to abide by the anti-torture rules. Those great executive orders, which had caused, a lot of debate within the administration. Greg Craig had pushed for these because he believed what he was told, that it was important to draw a line, that it was important to properly repudiate what had happened under the Bush administration. And one of the things that he did, realizing that the Uyghurs had been stranded in Guantanamo, realizing that trying to get other countries to take any of these men was going to be incredibly difficult if the United States did nothing itself. He was in the process of arranging for some of the Uyghurs to be brought to live in the United States. He had apparently secured the agreement of Defense Secretary Robert Gates, of Hillary Clinton. When the word got out to Republican senators, then they caused a huge stink about it, and he backed down. Now, pragmatically, I'm sure that was because of what he wanted from a bipartisan consensus and his healthcare plans and whatever. Whatever the pragmatic explanations of it are, it was such a betrayal of what needed to be done. And, it's a permanent disappointment to me that happened, because I've come from London, and in Britain we have, living in the country, I think there are 14 former Guantanamo prisoners. I've met most of them. A few of them are friends of mine. I work with one of them. And Omar Degayes, who's in the film, And the film is showing at Revolution Books tomorrow if people want to see it, and Omar features in it quite heavily. I've travelled round the country with Omar, and we've shown the film, and his testimony in the film is very, very powerful. And when people are able to meet him, having seen him in the film, it means a lot to them. But the most important thing is that being able to meet him, and it demonstrates to people the mistakes that were made in the war on terror. And it's something that I've spent 5 years now writing about. That Guantanamo is, for the most part, a colossal, inhuman mistake in which very few genuinely bad people were apprehended, and most people should not have been held there. Hundreds of people were completely innocent, seized by mistake, sold for bounty payments. And it's the thing that was cut off in this country, and that still is that you can't meet a former prisoner who was seized by mistake. And had the president had the courage to do that, I think it would have been the single biggest thing that could have happened. You can imagine, wherever they had settled, it may have been somewhere in the DC area, and you can imagine Fox News and all the other screaming right-wingers descending on them, and suddenly finding out that there wasn't a story, really. And who were these guys? These guys weren't terrorists. They never were terrorists. So, that's really one of my messages as we approach the 9th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo, is that one thing that's probably still worth pushing for, because without it there are people stranded in Guantanamo and they may stay there for years, and you'll have to put up with listening to me again in a year's time, and who knows, I might have to keep coming back, it's one of those things that we can do. There are other stories, but I shouldn't really go on too much, but there are Yemeni men cleared for release in Guantanamo, and a year ago President Obama issued a moratorium saying, I'm not going to release anyone to Yemen because a Nigerian guy tried to blow himself up on a plane and he was apparently recruited there. So these 58 men are in Guantanamo. The administration has said it wants to release them, but has gone back on that because it regards Yemen as a country that is such a dangerous terrorist state that nobody cleared from release from Guantanamo can be freed there because they imagine that they're going to go and join some terrorist cell. People that the administration has said it doesn't want to hold because they're not terrorists and they never were terrorists. Just to finish, Nancy and No More Guantanamos, Nancy up in Amherst in Massachusetts got the town to pass a resolution saying that they were prepared to accept cleared prisoners from Guantanamo. Berkeley is looking at this in a couple of weeks' time.
City Council.
That's also something that I think is worth looking at, because on this point, it's worth me as a British person shutting up, really, because it's an American story. And if American people can say to your own government, we don't think it's appropriate that these men are stuck in Guantanamo, who can't be sent home, and who you can't find new homes for them. They should be brought to live here. Then you can do that. You don't need to hear from me about that, because it's not a British story. It's yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and can you guys hear me? Is it this one? There are 3 microphones, and I can't figure out which one is actually on.
I think these.
I think they're all on. These two are the most important.
Does this work? This isn't on.
Don't miss an opportunity to spread the word. Use them all.
Okay, can you hear me? I guess can you hear me?
Put the silver one closer.
All right. Does this work? No. This one? No. This one works.
No. This the silver amplifies your voice,
But
and the others are just
But
recording.
none of them are on.
But is it working into the sheet?
I can just yell. I can try really hard to yell. So thank you for being here. It's really great to be here with Andy. I've followed his work a lot closely since I've been at CCR, and this is the first time we've actually had a chance to meet. So as Leili said, he's one of few journalists who has been covering the men detained in a way that few people have, and who I think know the stories in a way that even some of the lawyers who've been representing the men detained don't. I wanted to just start and say a few words about Farhi Saeed bin Mohammed. We've been, groups like CCR and others who have condemned these forcible transfers have been criticized by a number of groups, human rights organizations and groups even on the left, because of a feeling that certain objective conditions in Algeria have altered for the better, have changed for the better. But I would just say two things about his transfer. One is that the point here is that there was never any independent review of his fears of return. There was never any court that looked at what he was actually return and said, these fears are credible or not. And secondly, in terms of fears that count, there's both an objective and a subjective aspect to a fear of return. And whatever the objective reality may be in Algeria, this is a man who had won his habeas case, who had had a federal judge say that his detention of nearly 10 years was unlawful, and who was still Guantanamo, which I think underscores the depth of his subjective fears. So we learned that he was transferred yesterday. He's probably on a plane now or arriving now, and I would say that if you are disturbed by this at all, to do something and to write a letter, to write op-eds, to condemn this transfer, condemn forced transfers. There are other Algerians who remain at Guantanamo who are at similar risk, and condemn further future transfers of Algerians or anyone detained at Guantanamo who has a fear of return. So that's about Farhi. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, as Leili said, was another sort of leak, not a WikiLeaks, but a group of 4 brave men who came forward to expose another sort of abuse and crimes that were happening at Guantanamo around the period of 2006 that concerned the deaths of 3 men who were detained at the time. Before I go there, though, I just wanted to give a quick snapshot of where things stand with Guantanamo for those of you who may not know, and Andy covered some of this, but in terms of just the picture there are 174 men who remain detained, most of whom have never been and will never be charged, and more than half of whom have been cleared to leave Guantanamo, as Andy said, by the government's own task force. And when we say the government's own task force, this is a team that the Obama administration brought together that has representatives of every military and intelligence agency with a stake in the matter who have unanimously determined that these people are not individuals who should continue to be detained. So that's what we mean when we say these men have been cleared. More than half of the 174 have been cleared. As Andy said, there's a ban currently on all repatriations to Yemen, which the administration instituted last year after an attempted attack on an airliner by a Nigerian with alleged but unproven ties to Yemen, and which continues to be in effect and continues to block the transfer of all detainees from Yemen, even those who've been cleared, solely by virtue of where they come from, not because of anything they've been proven to have done. Transfers of men to third countries for resettlement have also slowed to a near halt, leaving there are about 30 to 40 men who are from countries who can't return, where they can't return because of a fear of persecution, and who are effectively trapped until third countries come forward. And those who are unfortunate enough, like Mr. Mohammed, are at risk of forcible transfer. If the day comes that the United States or the State Department determines that they need to be transferred, they may very well be transferred to those countries that they fear going back to. As Andy said, the option of resettlement in the United States has always been a near political impossibility, but Congress recently passed a bill that made it even more official, that includes provisions blocking the transfer of any detainee to the United States, forget resettlement or for asylum, but even to be imprisoned or for trial. And that includes provisions barring the transfers of detainees to other countries as well. These are individuals who've been cleared to leave by the government's review process, but bars their transfers if they are going to a country where a former detainee was released and then subsequently engaged in so-called recidivist activities. And it's important to keep in mind what the government has defined as recidivism. There are periodic reports that surface every once in a while that claim that X number of detainees have re-engaged in terrorism. When the names of those individuals have actually been released and we've been able to find out who the government's been talking about, some of them have included men who, for example, made a documentary about their time in Guantanamo, or who brought civil suits for damages for their torture, or who spoke out to the media. So these are some of the so-called recidivists that the government keeps talking about. And in addition to the congressional bill, administration, lawyers, and policymakers are busy preparing an executive order for President Obama to sign that will effectively institutionalize a system of indefinite detention for a group of men who remain detained, whom the government says it cannot charge, but who are too dangerous to release. So that's a bleak picture, and that's where we stand nearly a year after the prison was supposed to be closed, according to President Obama's promise. And the reality, obviously, is that the prison is not going to close without more and continued pressure from people who continue to think that it is a legal and moral outrage. So we need the continued pressure from people like you. And where there have been releases, they've been with absolutely no justice or accountability for the majority of men, and that's where I'll turn to this story that I wanted to talk about involving the three men who died at Guantanamo. There are three of them. Their names are Yasser al-Zahrani and Mani al-Utaibi, both of whom were from Saudi Arabia, and Salah al-Salami from Yemen. Just a few facts about them. Mani al-Utaibi was on a list of detainees to be transferred back home before he died, but didn't know it. Salah al-Salami's father, the Yemeni, the father himself actually recently passed, had prepared a videotape for attorneys to take to his son in Guantanamo and to show him, to give him strength and hope to continue to fight and challenge his detention, which Salah al-Salami never saw before he died. And Yasser al-Zahrani was 17 when he first came into US custody and was just 21 when he died. And his father found out about his death from a family member who had found out on television and that three men had died at Guantanamo, and heard the name al-Zahrani and called the father, Talal al-Zahrani, and said, "Hey, I think this might be your son." The US never contacted Yasser al-Zahrani's father or any of the families directly. The men's bodies were flown to the families on a US military plane later, too late for a proper burial, and with bruises and marks of abuse. The military immediately reported these deaths as suicides and said that the men had died by hanging themselves from nooses made from sheets in their cells. And some of you may remember some additional choice words that the military had at the time for characterizing the deaths. They called them acts of asymmetric warfare and a good PR move, but said little else about what had happened. An investigation was then conducted by the military, which took 2 years to complete, and the findings of which were only released as the result of litigation brought under the Freedom of Information Act, not because the government actually wanted to release any of those findings. But the military's investigation, came to the same conclusion that the men had in fact died from creating nooses made out of these bed sheets, and were found in their cells and transported from there to a medical clinic where they died or were confirmed dead. So last year, we filed a case on behalf of two of the families, al-Zahrani and al-Salami's families, who disbelieved the reports of suicide but wanted to try for accountability anyway. But our claims were premised on the theory that the military was responsible for the deaths, even if the men had taken their own lives, And we were bothered by the fact that we had to bring claims based on that theory. And I remember discussions at the time about the importance of making very clear that the families were not accepting the truth of the military's investigation, but again, thought that there was some responsibility, even if the men had taken their own lives, because of the 4 years of detention and torture that their sons had endured anyway. The case was dismissed earlier this year on the same grounds as a case that was ahead of us, brought by former Guantanamo detainees, and the court's decision, as in most cases, and I think Katie will talk more about this, as in most cases challenging abuse or policies in the realm of so-called national security, along the lines of those same cases, the court's decision in our case didn't reach the merits of the case at all. It didn't reach the substance of what we were alleging at all. So it didn't say that we hadn't proven wrongful detention or the deaths of our clients' sons, or that we hadn't proven that federal officials were actually involved or responsible for any of the deaths or for what we were saying had happened. But the holding was essentially that even if you assume that everything we said about the torture and the wrongful detentions and the deaths were true, that number one, the court had no power to even hear the case because it implicated military and foreign affairs concerns that were in the exclusive realm of the political branches and that the judiciary should not interfere with. Number two, that the federal officers we named had immunity, so that, again, even if what we had alleged constituted torture, and even if the officers had participated in the torture, that they couldn't have known that at the time of our client's son's detention, which was from 2002 to 2006, that what they were doing was actually illegal and unconstitutional, because it's still not clear, and the government continues to dispute, and the courts continue to agree, some of them, that the Constitution even applies to Guantanamo because it's not technically within US territory. And number three, that with respect to the international law claims we brought, these are separate from the constitutional claims, that the abuses we alleged, even if torture, even if criminal, seriously criminal, were still, quote, within the scope of employment of the federal officers, so long as their conduct was in some tangential way related to their jobs in terms of detaining and interrogating detainees. So those were the grounds that our case was dismissed on. Those are the same reasons that have been given in many other cases for torture and accountability. And again, they don't go at all to the substance or the merits of the allegations. They are really just about whether we can even get a foot in the door and have the court even hear the cases. And there's an additional bar in the case of Guantanamo detainees, which the court did not address, and that is a provision within the Military Commissions Act, which legislatively strips the federal courts from the power to hear any claims by Guantanamo detainees relating to their conditions or their treatment or their transfer, anything essentially other than their habeas claims. So there's that legislative bar as well, and it's a bar that we've said was struck down after the Supreme Court's decision in Boumediene versus Bush, which is the Supreme Court case that established the constitutional right of detainees to challenge their detentions through habeas corpus. We said this provision, stripping courts of jurisdiction and power to hear any other claims, was knocked down as well, and that even if it exists, it's unconstitutional to deprive detainees of any remedy at all, but that issue remains outstanding and the court didn't address it. So that was our case as of earlier last year or this year. And then in January, and this is where we get to the leak, in January of 2010, these four soldiers who were stationed at the base, who were on guard at the base at the time of the deaths, came forward. As one of them said, Joe Hickman, who is the lead soldier in Scott Horton's article in Harper's Magazine, said he came forward because he couldn't stay silent any longer. And according to their accounts, they came forward with a few very key facts that directly undercut the version that the military had put forward for all these years. And one was, and I'll just run through some of the facts, the article was published in January of 2010, as I said, in Harper's You can Google it and read it if you haven't already. But some of the key facts were, number one, that the military had said, as I said before, that the men were found dead in their cells and were transported from there to a medical clinic. Well, 2 of these 4 soldiers were on guard duty, as I said, and had direct observation of a walkway, and there was one walkway that connected the cells to the medical clinic, and said there was no traffic at all between the cells and the clinic that night, the night that the men were reportedly had been found dead. A second was that they said the only activity they did see that night was a van that was used to transport prisoners go from the camp where the men were detained in the direction of a secret site at Guantanamo that was informally known as Camp No, because it's an unofficial, undisclosed facility, and the response you're supposed to give when people ask you if it exists is no, it doesn't. So it sort of, there's this nickname of Camp No that developed, but this van took, the only traffic they saw was between the camp where the men detained and Camp No. 3 times this van went back and forth, and each time picked up a detainee from the facility and went in the direction of this camp. And then I think an hour and a half later, went from the camp to the medical clinic, backed up to the medical clinic, and seemed to have unloaded something. So that's the only traffic that these men did see. And again, they were on guard duty with direct observations of activity at the camp that night. Another is that the men, they said, arrived, that they were told by soldiers who were staffing the medical clinic the night in question, that the men arrived, 3 men arrived, dead, bruised, with rags stuffed in their throats, but arrived at the clinic an hour before the military's version of what happened said the men were found dead in their cells. So there's discrepancy in terms of the timing as well. And then they said that there was a gathering that night at the camp with dozens of other soldiers, where their commander at the time at Guantanamo basically told them that there would be a version of what happened coming out in the press the next day that would report that the men had died from hanging in their cells, and that they were not to contradict that report, not to speak out to the media, and they were reminded that their communications were being monitored. So those are some of the key facts that came forward. We submitted this evidence to the court, asking the judge to reconsider her dismissal of our case and reopen it in light of this evidence, and at least inquire further. She rejected our request. This was at the district court level, admitted that the allegations were disturbing, and there's some good language in the decision, almost apologizing for her ultimate decision, which was that ultimately she had no power to look into the case for the reasons that I've mentioned before, that these were essentially in the realm of national security and foreign policy, and that the court should not interfere. So the case was rejected. We're now in the process of appealing. And what I would just end with is that there's been relative silence in the mainstream media about this article and about the accounts of these 4 men. And some criticism of the conclusions that have been drawn from their accounts. But regardless of whether these facts conclusively add up to murder at a secret site at Guantanamo, there is at least, at a minimum, compelling evidence, new evidence, eyewitness accounts by 4 decorated soldiers who presumably had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward, that directly undercuts the military's version of what happened to these men that night, and that at least cries out for further investigation. So that's what we're trying to do with this case. Again, I would ask that if you're disturbed by this or interested in it, to go to CCR's website, read about our case, read about the facts, and if you're compelled to do more, to write letters to Eric Holder at the Department of Justice or your congressperson, and ask for an investigation. It's the only way that we're going to get any kind of accountability. It's extremely difficult in the courts. So it's really pressure from the public that I think is going to move the government on these issues. Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Katie Gallagher, who will talk about efforts to secure accountability for torture in Spain and elsewhere, given the lack of accountability in the United States and how this relates to Wikileaks. I'd like to quickly say that out on there's a table in the back over there, and there's a few documents which some of you might be interested in picking up before you leave after the end of our talks and discussions. One of them is a Closed Guantanamo with Justice Now document, which I've been working on with Jeremy from Witness, and our whole group has been working on. And it basically just gives you one document to hold, which I think in a concise way tells you the story of Guantanamo and lists the demands that we have, that CCR has, that Witness, we had Amnesty International also came up early on and signed it. List of demands for what closing Guantanamo with justice looks like. We've been circulating this around the world just for like less than a week. We have many signatures, and we have signatures from torture survivors, from scholars, from human rights groups and activists all over the world, the Middle East, Yemen, Egypt, Chile, Argentina, many groups in the United States. So I really encourage you to pick a copy up in the back before you leave tonight, and also you can visit our website, ccrjustice.org. And under our Guantanamo section, I just posted it there today for you to look, to pass around to other organizations, individuals, and also to sign. We intend on doing things with this document. It won't just be a dormant petition or statement. So please do pick that up. There's also an article about the Zahrani deaths cases that Pardiss just spoke about. So if you want some things to take with you, please do. And we'll turn it back to Katie.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. What we've heard so far is pretty grim. The reality of life at Guantanamo, the efforts by those who have been released from Guantanamo to seek justice in the United States. And it extends beyond just the detainees in Guantanamo. The same is true of victims of extraordinary rendition. The same is true, unfortunately, so far for victims of torture in Iraq. So these efforts in the United States have really so far proven unsuccessful for redress. They've also so far proven unsuccessful for prosecutions. Over the last 5 years, CCR, along with other groups that are here, have called for a special prosecutor to look into allegations of torture, whether at Guantanamo, at Bagram in Afghanistan, at Abu Ghraib. And these calls for investigations for torture have been met with silence, largely met with silence. The best that we got was the opening of an investigation into the destruction of CIA tapes that documented torture, waterboarding of detainees. Just last month, we were told, sorry, there won't even be an investigation about the destruction of evidence of torture, let alone the torture itself. So back in 2004, already 6 years ago, things looked pretty grim then. Efforts to access detainees at Guantanamo, efforts to stop torture at Guantanamo were meeting with very little success here in the US. So at that point, a handful of lawyers at CCR, working with lawyers in Europe, decided to try to seek justice outside of the United States. There's something called universal jurisdiction. And essentially, universal jurisdiction boils down to the fact that there are some acts that are so horrible, they are a crime anywhere. Torture, war crimes, those fit into this category. And those are, unfortunately, what we've been talking about tonight. So in 2004, the Center for Constitutional Rights, along with the International Federation for Human Rights in Paris and a group of lawyers in Berlin, headed by Wolfgang Kolleg, filed a complaint in Germany against Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was traveling to Munich to attend a NATO conference. And word came out that this complaint for calling for his prosecution for torture was coming. So the United States went into a flurry of diplomatic activity under the Bush administration, public flurry of diplomatic activity, and said, sorry, we have our Secretary of Defense who's coming to an important NATO conference. He won't come. If something doesn't happen, that we know he won't be prosecuted, called into court and asked to answer for torture. So very quickly, that case filed in November 2004 was dismissed. 2 years later, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld is just Donald Rumsfeld. ordinary citizen. And so at that point, we built a new case against him, against other members of the military, and this time added in those who were the architects of torture, the behind-the-scenes people, the John Hughes, the J. Bibies, the lawyers who wrote the torture memos that enabled the abuse we heard of at Guantanamo. And we filed another case saying, well, he's no longer a U.S. official. We've had 2 years of waiting for this justice. Germany, you have a robust law that calls for prosecutions of torture and war crimes. Use it. Well, at that point, the case was quietly dealt with and quietly. What's disturbing is that a piece of the decision echoed what we heard in U.S. courts, that what Donald Rumsfeld was doing was part of his job. Well, we tried again in 2007. Donald Rumsfeld, private citizen, was traveling to Paris. And so we brought a case against him there. And here the judge was very clear that no, I cannot look at this, because what Donald Rumsfeld was doing in torturing people was part of his job. That's what happens to detainees at Guantanamo. That's, in a nutshell, what the decision said. So efforts continued in the United States, and we kept an eye out for what we might be trying to do in Europe. In comes Barack Obama. While a candidate, he said, we're going to have accountability. We're going to end that chapter. But when he came in, he said, we're going to end that chapter by not looking back. Let's just move forward and forget about this. So in April of 2009, things started to happen in Spain. And as a little bit of a backstory to what happened in Spain that ultimately we've heard a lot more about through the Wikileaks cables, you had 4 detainees at Guantanamo, one of whom was a Spanish citizen, one of whom was a Spanish resident, and 2 of whom were ultimately wanted in Spain because these 4 men were all accused of being terrorists. They were alleged to have been involved in terrorist activities. So Balthazar Garzón, a notorious or famous, however you want to call him, depending on which side you're on, a judge in Spain initially was looking at these 4 men for terrorism charges because word came back when they were returned that they have links to terrorism. What the Spanish judiciary found instead was that no statement taken from any of these men at Guantanamo could be relied on to prosecute them because all these men had been tortured at Guantanamo. So there are decisions in the Spanish courts that make that finding. So we have Barack Obama come in January 2009, and in March of 2009, a complaint was filed in Spain under this universal jurisdiction law that they have, saying there are individuals who were tortured in Guantanamo. Your courts have found it. Let's do an investigation. And that complaint named 6 of the former Bush administration officials, the 6 lawyers who wrote the torture memos, who gave the legal cover for the program of torture. And I'll kind of interweave the WikiLeaks cables. So that complaint was filed in late March. And we see a cable that was released 3 weeks ago that is entitled that Spanish officials looking at torture by U.S. officials. So under Barack Obama, members of the Embassy of Spain, later members of the U.S. Congress, travel to Spain and have meetings with the Attorney General, with the prosecutor, with members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and members of the Ministry of Justice and say, this case cannot go forward. You have to do whatever you can to stop this case. To the credit of a number of the Spanish officials, they said, we can't stop it. There's a court looks at it, it's independent. We don't want it to go to Garzón, but there's not much we can do to stop it. What you can do to stop it, United States, is have investigations and prosecutions in the United States. That's consistently a theme of these cables that have come out, that the way out that Spain told the United States of being prosecuted there was to open real, true prosecutions here. So that first memo, that first cable comes out April 1st. the interesting thing there is that the prosecutor said, this looks like a very strong case. I think it's going to have to proceed. You have, again, a series of meetings that take place, and a cable comes out on April 17th that announces that the prosecutor has since changed his mind and has made an announcement that the charges in this complaint are fraudulent. And the cable in capital letters says, announcement follows intensive USG, United States government outreach. So the outreach was members of Congress going over and saying, this is going to impact the relations between US and Spain if you allow this case to proceed. Ultimately, the Bush 6 case, the case against the 6 lawyers, it received some coverage here in the United States when it was first filed. It did not go to Judge Balthazar Garzón. It went to a different judge, a judge named Judge Velasco. Contrary to what the cables suggest will happen, that Judge Velasco will close the case, he didn't close it. What he did is he sent a request to the United States on the 4th of May, 2009, and said, I have this case before me. Tell me why I shouldn't prosecute it. I shouldn't open an investigation. What are you doing in the United States to investigate or to prosecute individuals for torture? Send on information about what's happening in the United States. So that was May 4th, 2009. Nothing. You know, as far as we saw, the United States was ignoring this case. What it ended up doing was continuing to have these behind-the-scenes meetings we see through the cables. Judge Velasco sent a second request and said, tell me again, you know, what is it that you're doing? He's now sent 3 requests to the United States over the last year and a half. He has not closed the case, but he has been, I would say, fairly patient, maybe a little too patient in waiting for a US government response. The Center for Constitutional Rights in April of 2010 submitted an expert opinion to Judge Velasco, explaining to him why it is that he should have this case proceed. We explained that nothing is happening here. We explained the failure of prosecutions, investigations, and the blockage on behalf of the judges to allow any cases to proceed for the victims of torture. Now, in December, once the Wikileaks cables came out, we submitted another updated expert report to Judge Velasco and explained again the culture of impunity that exists in the United States. And we documented for him the Wikileaks cables and showed how they fed into this culture of impunity. Tomorrow we're making a third submission to Judge Velasco, and we're laying out for him how this case against the Bush 6, the 6 lawyers, should proceed legally, grounding it in international criminal law. But that's not the only case happening in Spain. Because as I said, Judge Garzón had initially been looking at charges against these released Guantanamo detainees. When he handed back the Bush 6 case, he turned around the next week and he said, well, I'm going to open my own investigation. I have 4 victims of torture here. So in April of 2009, Judge Garzón opened an investigation, which led to another cable saying he's gone around and he's done something different. He's opened his own case. What should we do? The Spanish prosecutor said, don't worry. There are ways to embarrass him. I have some information that we can put in. You know, he's a person who likes media attention. The case will go away quickly. Well, that case hasn't gone away. Judge Garzón also asked the United States for its views on whether the case should proceed. The US also didn't respond to him. He waited 3 months, and then he said, okay, I'm opening now a full investigation. He's heard the evidence, Judge Garzón, of 2 of the victims of torture. He's heard an expert witness. Unfortunately, within Spain, there is a backlash against universal jurisdiction and looking at crimes, whether outside of Spain or inside of Spain. And Judge Garzón also opened an investigation into the Franco era, and that resulted in him ultimately being suspended as a judge. So a different judge has since taken over that case. And we are submitting tomorrow to the new judge, Judge Ruse, a dossier explaining why he should subpoena Jeffrey Miller, who was the commander at Guantanamo, to come and testify before him and explain his role in the torture at Guantanamo and later in Iraq. So we're hopeful, and we'll see what Judge Roos does, but we will continue to press for accountability because we're not getting it here, and we need to have it. So, thanks.
Let me begin by saying that I'm not an attorney. I don't have a legal mind. I'm not a journalist. I hate deadlines. I'm not a human rights professional. I made a different career choice. I'm probably much closer to most of you here, just like an average citizen, an average guy, like sick at heart about what I've learned over the last 9 years. Perhaps what separates me from many of you is that I've tried to do something about all these issues in a sustained and concerted way, and then developed a kind of, shadow career as a citizen advocate around justice and accountability with respect to the war on terror, broadly defined. And then I don't want to talk about demoralization and outrage and anger. I want to talk today a little bit about hope and action and what people can accomplish when they come together in community and rally around the things that they care deeply about and try to do something meaningful in a public way, like all these folks have done up here today. I've been to a number of talks like this. I generally try to avoid them because they tend to be so depressing. The devil's in the details. We've heard a lot of horrible details. They've scratched the surface. There's 10 or 20 other issues they could talk about with equal passion and indignation, sadly. And then in big picture terms, things look very bleak. Guantanamo is still open. Arguably, its closure is more remote than during the darkest stage of the Bush administration, okay? Because then we thought if a new president comes into office, the winds of hope, the winds of change will change things. There's a big sort of public will to repudiate the Bush legacy. Our prince, took the throne and the kingdom remains rotten. And then how and why that's so is a story whose dimensions we still fully don't know. Jane Mayer hasn't written the article yet. Where good intentions horribly mismanaged, where the intentions not so good is the right, more powerful than we thought. Sometimes I think Obama cares more about what Rush Limbaugh thinks than what the ACLU or CCR thinks, and that's profoundly disturbing. I mean, they're sort of so afraid of kind of backlash from this quasi-fascist element in American political life that they are paralyzed to make good on their own stated intentions. But again, I don't want to sort of dwell on the negatives, but rather, share a message of, hope and how I've been inspired by, friends, colleagues, and comrades who've decided that it is morally imperative that they do something about things that are morally outrageous. To share the story, I want to share briefly the story of the organization that I'm a part of. It's called Witness Against Torture. I don't know how many of you have heard about it. We're probably, I'm sort of embarrassed to say, like the leading grassroots organization in the United States fighting to close Guantanamo and end torture. I'm embarrassed because it shouldn't be up to us, but in a twisted way, that's the burden that we've assumed. It started in 2005 when a bunch of friends, many of them involved in the Catholic worker community, read the newspaper, watched the television, were profoundly disturbed, learned what they could about the detainees, about Guantanamo, and asked themselves 3 questions. What can I do? Okay, and that's where it all starts. What can I do? Second, what can I do with others in community that I can't do myself? And in this society and in probably every other, there's very little, properly speaking, as an individual that you can do. Rosa Parks didn't act alone, Martin Luther King didn't act alone. Everybody is working in community and in organization. And the third thing they ask themselves is, what can we do together if we take fear out of the equation? We don't worry about consequences, arrest, fine, imprisonment. And it's not only taking a fear of consequences out, but striking against fear itself, because so much of this is about fear of terrorism, of terrorists, of Muslims, of foreigners, of others, of brown-skinned people, of the unknown, of chaos. What could they do that would strike at fear itself? And they decided as friends to get on a plane, go to Cuba, land in Cuba, and then walk 80 kilometers while fasting to go to the gates of the Guantanamo prison and hold an act of religious witness and a demonstration against the prison camp. And then they fasted because at the time many prisoners inside Guantanamo were hunger striking. The sort of last weapon of the weak and the helpless and the powerless is sort of their own body. They were hunger striking for the right to challenge their detention, see their family have some day in court. And then it was an act of powerful, solidarity that tried to, mark and acknowledge the humanity and the dignity of the people suffering inside the prison and articulate a critique of American policy. And then to our great satisfaction and delight, a lawyer, Tom Wilner, who many of these folks know, took the message of the protest into the prison, and the message that the detainees knew about the protest made it out of the prison. And then members of our group were sort of personally thanked on behalf of whomever in Guantanamo that it made a difference, that they'd lost hope virtually in the American legal system, faith in the American political system, but the presence of these 25 people in Cuba in winter, risking arrest and whatever else, gave them hope that there were people of conscience and goodwill in the United States, and that meant everything to them because they had very little else left. And then that inaugurated Witness Against Torture. It sort of set the tone for the organization. And then since then, we've been engaged in the use of every tool in the toolbox of democracy to try to get justice on these issues, lobbying and petitioning, fasting, marching, demonstrating, and also engaging in nonviolent direct action. That's perhaps what distinguishes us from other advocate groups. It's important for us to sacrifice a little bit on behalf of people who are suffering an enormous amount. I mean, a dimension of it is to sort of symbolically take on the suffering of the people we stand in solidarity with. And then also because we want to forcefully speak a message of truth and justice to powerful people who have become, sadly deaf to both. And just to highlight one action, when the habeas case was being litigated, first we went on the day that their boss, Michael Ratner, was going into the Supreme Court and stood outside the Supreme Court in jumpsuits and a sign. Our picture was on page 17 of the New York Times. This is the kind of thing that PR firms charge a lot of money to get your picture in the paper, but we were in the right place in the right time. And then, right before the Supreme Court heard the case, we had essentially an occupation of the lobby of the Supreme Court, the first time in the history of America, allegedly, or apparently, that the Supreme Court's been sort of shut down. And 40 of us stood outside the Supreme Court in hoods and jumpsuits. Another 40 of us were inside the Supreme Court. They kind of locked us in when they realized that we were, a protest community. And then we sat in a circle and chanted, "Shut it down." The justices were in their offices that day. It was a Friday, deliberating. And it was like a kind of sort of tear in time, this sort of deeply transcendental sort of moment for me, in which sort of something powerful was communicated in a place that's all about the law as a kind of fundamental bulwark against tyranny. I was sort of inspired by the setting, and I felt acting in concert with the values articulated on the slogans and in the reliefs and in the sort of educational tour that was part of the whole presentation of the Supreme Court as a kind of civic temple and shrine to American ideas. We had a trial subsequent to that action in June. I'm messing up the timeline a little bit. And then in the days shortly following, the Supreme Court issued the Boumediene decision granting, the power to file a habeas petition in federal courts for the detainees. I should say in addition that when we were arrested, we took the names of the detainees instead of our own. So we told the police, "I am whomever, and then entered court as detainees. And the idea was to symbolically give them a day in court that they had been denied by the United States judiciary. I didn't think of this. I wish I did. It's what I call moral genius, a way that the moral logic of what you're doing is embodied in the conduct itself. We had wonderful lawyers representing us. We were convicted, suffered marginal penalties, but that wasn't really the point. And that's just an example of the passion, dedication, and commitment that we try to bring to things. Our hearts soared when Obama signed the executive orders. We almost retired our Close Guantanamo banner. We had a meeting to discuss, should we end our own organization, and go our own separate ways and, meet for beers and coffee. We decided to stick around in Washington, to stand in the cold and rain with our banners, to support the president in realizing his intentions with his executive orders. And then, one sort of bad thing happened after another, a kind of, sort of cascade of, sort of politics and contingent events have conspired to keep Guantanamo open, to prevent any real system of accountability, to further, dehumanize and denigrate the detainees, to sustain the lie that they're the worst of the worst, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a very, very difficult point. dispirited, but not completely demoralized. We're not going away. We're not giving up. We'll be in Washington on January 11th. There'll be a demonstration at the White House. Some of the folks here are going to speak there. We have direct action planned at the Justice Department. It's kind of an open secret. A number of us are going to be fasting for 10 or 11 days. And then we did this last year, and people around the world have participated, including the wife of a former detainee, including school children in Afghanistan, living in the hills in a part that is, very, very active war zone. And then Witness Against Torture, like it's a name and it's an organization, but more importantly, it's an idea. And then none of us owns the idea. And as far as we're concerned, it's an idea that's in the sort of possession of, humanity. And then any time, somebody's sort of conscience is moved to oppose in ways private or public what you've heard about today, they're participating in a kind of witness against torture. You can think of it in spiritual terms, political terms, secular terms, cosmic terms. It doesn't, matter. And then what we ultimately stand for is the integrity and inviolability of the human body. Basic American precepts: innocent until proven guilty. You should have a right to challenge your detention. That no tyrant can lock you up, and sort of whisk you away without having some sort of public account of, why that they've done that. And then, most fundamentally, that our public life and our legal system should be guided by fairness, compassion and love, and not fear, hatred, and belligerence. So the message I want to give today is, know that there are allies who are, active on these issues. And then, realize the sort of power of one when working in concert with other people. When I heard that folks had gone to Guantanamo, I didn't go myself. It was like a message in a bottle that had come from some distant shore. And I said, I want to know those people. And a lot of them live in New York. And I got to know them. And it's not just Witness Against Torture. It's No More Guantanamos. It's CCR. It's 9/11 families. So there's a lot of these wonderful bottles carrying wonderful messages. One arrived from the shores of, England. And if you're sitting there, as disconcerted and depressed and outraged as, I once was, that's a wonderful starting point. But then the next phase of things is to do something in a public way that takes time, effort, maybe money to, contribute to the forces like those gathered around this table, fighting for, justice on all these issues. So that's it from me, okay?